Imagine you're a federal agent working a drug trafficking case on the border. Right now, cartels are treated legally as criminal organizations, so your tools are limited. But what if overnight, Congress flipped a switch and these groups became foreign terrorist organizations? Suddenly, you've got the same authorities used to hunt ISIS. You can freeze their money, sanction anyone who supports them, pursue them globally. Sounds like a massive win, so why hasn't it happened? The answer involves Mexico's sovereignty, billions in trade, and a blueprint called Plan Colombia. Let's take a look. Over 100,000 people killed since 2006. That's not a typo. Mexico's cartel wars have produced a death toll that rivals full military conflicts, and most people scrolling their feeds have no idea. Here's what actually happened. When President Calderon sent the military after the cartels in December 2006, the plan made sense on paper. Hit them hard, hit them fast, break them up. But breaking up a big cartel doesn't make the violence go away. What it does is create 10 smaller groups, all of them fighting each other for the same territory the big one used to control. So instead of one Sinaloa cartel running a region, you've got splinter factions shooting at each other on the same streets, and the body count just keeps going up. Over 30,000 drug-related murders were estimated in the years right after that crackdown started. Think about what that actually looks like for people living there. In places like Tamaulipas and Sinaloa, the local police aren't really working for the government. They're on cartel payroll. Mayors get phone calls telling them who's really making decisions in their town. That's not a crime problem in the traditional sense. That's a second government operating right next to the real one, and in some places it's more powerful. So here's where it gets complicated for Washington. The Congressional Research Service looked hard at this and found something that surprised a lot of people. Yes, the death toll in Mexico is massive and documented, but the hard data showing that violence is physically crossing into US cities in any broad, measurable way? It's surprisingly thin. Part of the reason is technical. The FBI's crime tracking system literally cannot separate drug trafficking violence from regular violent crime. So even when something cartel-related happens in a US city, it might not get logged in a way that anyone can pull later and point to. But thin data isn't the same as no problem. Laredo, El Paso, border towns up and down the Rio Grande have all reported kidnappings, extortion operations, and shootings that investigators traced back across the river. In February 2011, ICE Special Agent Jaime Zapata was ambushed and killed by Los Zetas inside Mexico. Another agent, Victor Avila, was wounded in the same attack. There were also reports of cartels actively plotting against Texas Rangers and ICE agents. So the threat to US personnel is documented and real. And it's not just the immediate border area either. The National Drug Intelligence Center found that Mexican drug trafficking organizations had active operations in at least 230 US cities. That's not 230 border towns. That's cities spread across the whole country. Now, having an operation in a city isn't the same as shooting people in that city. But it means the reach is there, and any spillover violence wouldn't just show up in El Paso. It could show up anywhere. So the situation policymakers are actually dealing with is this. The scale of the crisis in Mexico is undeniable. Specific incidents of violence affecting Americans are documented. But a comprehensive data picture showing a broad trend of cartel violence crossing the border just doesn't exist yet. Agents on the ground know what they're seeing. The numbers to back it up at a policy level are still incomplete. And that gap is a big reason why the FTO debate keeps stalling out in DC. What would it even mean to flip that switch and label these groups terrorists? So what does the FTO label actually do? Because this is where people get confused. It's not just a name change on a government list somewhere. Right now, cartels fall under something called the Kingpin Act. That law lets the Treasury Department freeze assets and sanction individuals tied to drug trafficking. It's a real tool, and it has hurt cartel finances in specific cases. But FTO status operates on a completely different level. Here's why. Under an FTO designation, it becomes a federal crime to provide what the law calls material support to the group. And that definition is broad. We're talking the same legal authority the US used against Al-Qaeda after 9/11. So think about what that means in practice. A US bank that processes cartel money isn't just being negligent anymore. It could be looking at criminal exposure. A lawyer who knowingly takes on a cartel leader as a client faces new legal risk. Anyone who moves money, provides resources, or assists these groups in any documented way is now potentially a federal criminal. That's a very different world than what exists today. Supporters in Congress say that's exactly the point. They want sharper legal teeth. They want the ability to chase cartel financing networks globally the same way the US goes after terrorist money. And on paper, the argument makes sense. If the tools worked against international terror networks, why not use them here? But then you run into Mexico, and Mexico is not a small problem to manage around. It's a $600 billion trading partner, the USMCA agreement. That's the trade deal that replaced NAFTA. Ties the two economies together at basically every level. Auto parts, agriculture, manufacturing. The relationship is deep and it runs both ways. Mexican officials have been direct about this. They've said publicly that an FTO designation would look like the US declaring that Mexico can't handle its own security, which, politically, is something no Mexican government can just accept. And if that relationship breaks down, so does the cooperation that currently helps US agents track cartel networks in the first place. You lose the partnership right when you need it most. There's another layer that doesn't get enough attention. Aid organizations operating in cartel-controlled areas of Mexico could technically be exposed under a material support charge. Same goes for immigration lawyers, journalists, and researchers who work in those regions. The law doesn't really have a clean carve-out for people doing legitimate work in dangerous places. So the same statute that goes after cartel financiers could snag people who have nothing to do with drug trafficking. Then there's Plan Colombia. And this comparison comes up constantly in policy discussions. Colombia's approach did work. Drug production dropped, security improved, the big cartels lost their grip. But it took about 15 years. It required massive US military and financial support, and it worked in part because Colombia had a centralized national police force that could actually receive and act on that support in a coordinated way. Mexico doesn't have that. It has thousands of local police forces, and a significant number of them are already compromised by cartel money or cartel threats. There's no clean unified command structure to plug US resources into. So even if the FTO designation passed tomorrow, the on-the-ground reality in Mexico would make the Colombian playbook extremely difficult to run. Nobody is actually arguing that cartels aren't dangerous. That part everyone agrees on. The real question is whether a law built for ideological terrorist groups motivated by religion or politics, is the right tool for criminal networks that are basically running parts of Mexico's economy and local government right now. So if you're near the border, or you just want to know what DC is really fighting about, here's the honest answer. There's no clean fix. And anyone telling you there is, they're selling something. The Merida Initiative puts nearly $500 million a year into this problem. Bye for now.